Welcome to the ACMHE March webinar. I'm Beth Wadham, and we're pleased to present Consciousness in Action this afternoon with Raúl Quiñones-Rosado and Rose Sackey-Milligan of Se Integral. And I'll just say a little bit about Consciousness in Action, what I've learned so far, and I hope to learn much more. Consciousness in Action is part of an emerging integral activism which brings critical analysis, liberation psychology, and spiritual perspective to the process of personal, social, economic, political, and cultural transformation. I guess that about covers it. The webinar today will outline the key principles, processes, and practices of this approach. And Se Integral offers workshops and leadership retreats to social and environmental justice organizers and activists that help develop a deep understanding of the systemic and structural forms of oppression and how these play out based on race, gender, class, sexuality, and ability. And they offer practical solutions to the challenges these present in classroom and other settings. And both Raúl and Rose will be presenting today. Raúl Quiñones-Rosado is the founder and co-director of Se Integral. He has been a social justice educator and organizer for more than 20 years, and he's been active in movements against racism, colonialism, militarism, and other forms of oppression. He's the author of Consciousness in Action, Toward an Integral Psychology of Liberation and Transformation, as well as other published writings. And Raúl has presented this integral approach to audiences internationally. Rose Sackey-Milligan is co-director, and she's an educator and socio-cultural anthropologist with about 13 years of experience in social change philanthropy. Rose is the former director of programs at the Peace Development Fund and director of the social justice program at our own Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. She's facilitated numerous workshops in self-analysis, leadership development, and building self-esteem. We welcome them both, and thanks so much for offering this presentation.
Thank you, Beth, for that warm welcome. I'd like to thank the Center for giving Se Integral this forum to share its Consciousness in Action model. And we are excited, I'm sure I speak for Raúl and I, to say that we are excited and looking forward to hearing your questions and sharing your comments. Before Raúl begins, I just wanted to say very quickly that this model, Consciousness in Action, is an outgrowth that is grounded in more than 20 years of Raúl's work in communities of struggle, both with the Institute for Latino Empowerment and for ILE, Organizers for Consciousness in Action. Raúl has played a very important role at the center in the social justice program. This model had been used for several of our retreats, and it was on its way to becoming a strong central point, a point of focus for our Transforming the Culture of Organizing retreats for activists and organizers as they explore the value and relationship between innoism, transcendence, and social action. So with that very brief introduction, I pass it on to Raúl.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Rose. And thank you all for being here. You know, I wish that that I could see everyone's faces. And we're used to doing this in person, yeah. Because really, what we want to do here is to share and to briefly part of our work. You know, that we've been doing, Rose said, for some time now. But it's great to be here, you know, and I also want to let people know that I'm, you know, really fascinated with the technology that we're able to connect. I'm not sure where you all are at. I know that Rose and Beth and the people at CMIND are in Northampton, Massachusetts, while I'm here in the mountain town of Calle, Puerto Rico. So that So you might be able to hear the birds in the background, and perhaps at some point you might hear my dog barking, or maybe even my baby grandchild, crying in the background. So it's all good, and it's all part of the environment that makes it real. So okay, so I'd like for us to start off with the next slide here. Because what I want to be showing you is, again, an overview of okay, here we go, overview of the consciousness in action approach, and it's our integral approach to liberation and transformation. As you can see here that this work is based on an integral view of human well-being and development that is informed by a critical analysis of identity, power, and culture. But it's also grounded in it's not a theoretical only grounding. It's grounded, as Rose said, it's grounded in an experience, in our own experiences personally, professionally, of working 20, 30 years in communities of struggle. It's based and grounded in the critical analysis and experiences of many of our elders and our teachers that have been with us, in person, some of our mentors, and through the literature and the wisdom, knowledge left behind of so many people. So it is important to make that clear that this is part of an experience of life-learned lessons passed on across generations from people in communities of struggle. This is also grounded and rooted and inspired, guided by an ethic of liberation. Some of the values and principles and conducts that not only affirm liberation from social injustice, but that is an ethic that actually reproduces, and viably sustains the integral well-being and the full development of all people, or what might be known as correct means. So this is it is an integral view that is rooted in an analysis, but that is guided by an ethic, values and principles, and a conduct, a way of being in the world. And that it is an approach that is created and nurtured and sustained through transformative practices or praxis at all levels of being. It is personal, institutional, cultural, and it operates simultaneously on the various levels of being, and therefore that's why we refer to it as an integral approach. And then I just want to mention before we move to the next slide that since this is a webinar specifically intended for contemplative educators, we want to spend some more time. We want to get to the consciousness in action as a transformative practice or contemplative practice as a facilitator of consciousness in action. So that we want to sort of be able to get to that last piece, but in order to get there we have to go through the integral view and critical analysis. Our time is not going to allow us to talk much about liberation ethic, but we'll do the best that we can to move it along. So during the next 40 minutes or so, if you have questions, please write them down, either in the little box there, but actually, if I start looking at that, I know I'll get distracted. And so if you jot them down somewhere and bring them up at the Q&A at the end, that would be great. But I will also suggest and ask you to pay attention as we move along, to notice within yourself, any questions or doubts that you might have that might come up, but not only in your mind, in your thinking, but also disagreements that or a feeling that you might have about something that distracts you from being present and having presence in this during this presentation. And so please make a note of that too, and then maybe we'll have time to bring it up towards the end of the Q&A. So Rose, if we can move to the next slide. What we're going to be seeing here in the next slide. In our dry run, this tends to move a little quicker through the. I can see the computer sort of struggling a little bit with the slides. What we're going to be seeing here now, yes, is so the integral nature of our approach. It really has no beginning or an end, and hence the integral nature. But rather, it begins wherever you happen to be. Wherever a person or a group happens to be, that's the beginning. However, in the sharing of it with you, I'd like for us to start by getting grounded in some of the key concepts of the model of framework related to integral well-being and development. You can see here that that at the center, that at the core of being, that we are beings of consciousness and will. That manifest, that come into the personal dimension as expressed through a physical, or mental, or spiritual, or emotional aspects of the self, or how these express themselves in the world. Now, it's important to understand from this integral view that these aren't discrete. It's not. We're not necessarily talking about the physical body or the mind and the spirit. All of those things and things associated with the physical, the mental, spiritual, and emotional, but they're not discrete and separate. Clearly, I'm sure that you understand that these are merely representations to help us talk about it. But it's important to understand, so just to say a word about that, and to know that that this all happens together. And including that that personal dimension, that individual dimension of the physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, does not exist by itself. We prefer to say personal and not individual, because individual might lead us to believe that we are something separate from the collective. And in our approach and our view of the world and of well-being development, that's not what's going on. The person is an integral aspect of the collective, in community, and families, and organizations, and nations, and this world that happens to organize itself in 4 aspects as well: economic, political, cultural, and social. That all of these aspects and elements of both dimensions emerge and develop integrally or dynamically in relationship to one another. So therefore, if you could click again, Rose, one more click, you will see that this well-being, that our well-being and our development occurs by us tapping our particular strength and resources, but also our collective ones, also of our families and our communities and of our nations and so forth. But also in the context of the challenges and obstacles that are presented in the larger sphere of our of being, which, by the way, at the bottom right-hand corner, you will see that the larger context of all of this that's happening is the physical and metaphysical context. That just to be clear that what we're talking about here is a more of a human dimension, but clearly aware that we are just one aspect of something much, much larger. So that well-being, integral well-being and development is expressed, or we move towards that. It is an ongoing process of greater well-being and that involves balance between all of these different aspects and both dimensions. So for there to be well-being, or a greater level of well-being, because there is no such, perfect state of well-being, there we move towards a greater balance between those different aspects. So there's a sense of equilibrium between those different aspects, the physical, the mental, and spiritual, at the personal level, but at the collective level, that there's the economic, that there's balance between how our economy works, and paying attention and giving energy to that aspect of the material resources, production, work, so forth, or the political aspect that's connected and related to authority and how we handle that, or the cultural aspect connected to subjectivity, or the social aspect that is more related to the affective parts of ourselves. So that there's a balance between all those things, that one is not more important than the other. But the other element is a characteristic is harmony, so that there's actual congruence between those. That, in other words, that if the spiritual is connected to our cultural values and principles that guide us, and the mental is connected to our ideas and our ideologies, even, that our physical has to do with our behaviors in society, in the world, and for there to be the well-being and the possibility of ongoing development, it depends on that there being congruence between all of those aspects. That we walk our talk, that we practice what we preach, that we don't say that we hold certain values and then in practice not do so. That is what leads us then to integrity in the sense of wholeness, but also in the sense of authenticity. When a person has integrity, there is deep authenticity of being. And there is also strength. I think of structural integrity of a building. All of the pieces and aspects and parts have to fit together cohesively in balance and harmony, so that there's structural integrity and strength that can then lead to authentic self and authentic power. So if we could move to the next slide for a little breather. Yes, so catch a little breath here. There's a lot of information to digest in all of these, not only the visuals, but as I'm speaking to you. And we want to make sure that we establish this foundation while still continuing to move a little quickly. And here what we're seeing is, what we just saw was the basic foundation of what integral well-being is. And here we're moving to the more internal or the psychosocial aspect of part that's really important to us and for attaining or moving towards some degree of integral well-being and development. Because, as I said, we do this in the context of the challenges and the obstacles, or, if you will, the chaos of collective life. So in that, we must ask ourselves, so what happens to our authentic self, as we live in and as a part of society? So there's a lot that's going on in terms of personal identity, but here we want to focus quickly on social identity, on the very important psychosocial aspects of that. And what just got laid out there as I was talking was that we are born into a society that already has an arrangement where people in society are arranged by social group identities to do with race, class, political affiliation, nationality, ethnicity, faith, sexuality, gender. We might add age and ability, both physical and mental. And but not only these broad categories, but that even within each category, we are arranged even before we were born. Now that in terms of gender, now that that we can know the gender of a baby before they're born. You know, they're born knowing what race. Well, in many of these, we know what groups they will belong to. So we are born into social groups that have its membership and has its identity, and it has a certain arrangement. And here it not only clearly points out what the different groups are in terms of race, like whites, blacks, Latinos, indigenous peoples, Asians, Arabs, etc., and class. You could see that on your screen. I want to go through each one. But in each of those categories, there are these groups. But not only, so there are these many different groups, but there is a relationship. The configuration, the placement, and the size of these words are not accidental. There, it goes to indicate that there is a relationship between the members of the groups. So that so blacks, Latinos, indigenous, Asians stand in relationship, in a power relationship to whites in terms of race, as do women, transgendered, and gender non-specific persons stand in a power relationship to men in the society, and therefore, and equally all of them. Then, before I move on, I want to also point out that what we intend to illustrate in this graphic is that they're all connected, that they're all dynamic, that they're all related. You cannot really and deeply talk about race without talking about gender and class and sexuality and all of the different social identities. They're dynamic, they are complex. We have all of them, and the other two that I mentioned, and who knows what others. So these are all aspects of every single one of us. So maybe we can move to the next slide. Rose. This, so clearly this also begins to illustrate our place and our rank in relationship to each other. I'm going to go very quickly through this too. This also then moves us from the to look at a more institutional lens. Look at this reality from an institutional lens already. That shows quickly that we live within a society that is organized in the ways that I mentioned, economically, politically, culturally, socially. And that there are institutions that have been created and designed for the purpose of maintaining that culture in place, that way of being, that society, a certain order in place, and that there are financial, commercial, industry, and that there are all political parties in government, and all of these many institutions in place that were created in order to give continuity, in order to organize society, and that they are very much needed in every society, and they serve a function. It is also important to note here that that there is also a relationship between the dominant social groups that we saw in the previous slide: men, whites, owning class, pro-status quo, U.S. Americans, European Christians, heterosexuals. That there's a relationship between the dominant members of those groups with the institutions in our society. And that's no accident. That's not coincidental. That is by design. As you know, they were historically, this is part of a historic analysis, they were white men, owning class, heterosexuals, Christians of European descent in the United States, later becoming citizens, that designed and created and established these institutions and that pass them along. The important thing here before ending is also for us to make a note that, that we, all of us here, regardless of whether we're dominant members or subordinated members, whether we're part of any one of these dominant groups, or of the subordinated ones, that we also have a place in a relationship to the institutions, and that we serve as gatekeepers and players in this arrangement. So we can move to the next slide, Rose. It's within the same slide. It can show that what I call, referred to also often as the sphere or the ring of power. When I saw Lord of the Rings, I thought of the ring of power, or the sphere of power in relationship to community of struggle. Okay, good. The next slide here is, given our social identities and the institutions, that it is not where, when we talk about oppression, that it's not only at a personal level, it's not a matter of personal experience or only at the institutional level, but that when we talk about racism and classism, liberalism, imperialism, Eurocentrism, religious oppression, heterosexism and sexism and the other forms of oppression, that this is really a larger system and a culture, if you will, a cyclone of oppression, a culture of imposition that is perpetuated through the institutions, and that is and permeated throughout the culture and internalized psychologically as we're growing up in the society. You know, as we go to school, get exposure to, you know, go to our houses of worship, exposed to the media, and so forth. So the next slide would give us another breathing. Yeah, so after having taken that deep breath, which I know I needed, and maybe many of you also, we can see, you have a quick glance at the cognitive, affective impacts. Maybe you might need to click again, Rose, for to see just how it is that these different forms of oppression have psychologically, cognitively, and our feelings have an impact on all of us. Not only people of color and women, gays, lesbians, bisexual, poor, working class people that are subordinated and oppressed by these forms of oppression, but everyone. Not in the same way, definitely not in the same way, but everyone is impacted at the level of perception itself, that our perception, the way that we see the world, is distorted. We are not, because of racism, because of the different forms of oppression, we are no longer able to see the world as it is, to hear the world, to smell even the world as it is, but it is distorted. That our conceptual frames of how it is that we make sense of the world, the labels that we use, the methods of analysis that we use, the language that we use, not only English or Spanish, whatever language, but the words, that they are biased and distorted by oppression, that our judgments, the values themselves of what we even might consider the good, the beautiful, and the truth. If we were to study philosophy, and all of the judgments that come out of it are impaired and distorted and tainted because of oppression. And that emotionally, that psychologically, internally, it results in an emotional reactivity of a collapse, of a self-contraction, of a defensiveness. You might need to click again here, Rose. Of a distortion, of a defensiveness, of a withdrawal and distancing, from not only from others, but even from aspects within ourselves. So that, and you can click after that to move to the next slide as well. You know, so that all of this emotional reactivity can result in, in aggressiveness, in oppressive or self-harming behaviors, and usually it is towards oneself first and then extends outward. And so this is where consciousness in action comes in, and the beginning of the process of transformative praxis, that we can then, begin to deal with that distorted perception, and replace that with an ability to perceive, to move towards perception and see the world as it is, to undo and counteract our distorted and our biased conceptual frames with a clear recognition, and reframing and renaming of the world, and move to a deep understanding beyond our impaired judgments and distorted values, so that then we can move to respond instead of simply reacting to the world. And this is the clear place of where this transformation begins to happen, which is more than just a struggle towards trying to free ourselves from oppression, but it's really about transforming. It's towards transforming ourselves while we, not before or so that we can then begin to transform the world, but while we are moving to address social injustice and move towards transforming the world itself. So we can move to the next breather. Take a deep breath.
So to ground this theory in this model in some experiences and practice will be of use for us this afternoon. It will be useful to offer a few concrete examples of what Raúl has offered. I remember when we first offered this notion of reaction versus responding, there was a lot of angst and wonder about this model, particularly because social change workers are about reacting. That's what they do. That's what reversing social injustice requires. And so it was very difficult to make the distinction in their minds about the difference between reacting and responding. And so I offer a story. There was a young woman in one of our retreats whose work was primarily in the criminal justice system. And her work was with addressing issues of racial profiling. And as she walked down the street one day, I believe it's in New York City, she came upon a slew of police cars and policemen who were clearly in the act of arresting several young men of color. And she talked about the immediacy of her rage, and her immediate response was to shout and yell and to cause attention to what she perceived to be an act of violence. And in retelling the story to her colleagues, the response was, this is why we have to do what we do. The police are killing us, therefore we need to kill them too. But however, over time, with the understanding of this transformative work, over time with addressing her own personal transformation, she came to the conclusion that, and as she learned the difference between reacting and responding, and noticing the places within herself where there was a tremendous amount of anger, responding, she learned, meant that a place of compassion needs to be held for a force of people who have a different understanding, who had lost their humanity in the process of their work. She learned that a different way of responding would be not to be in a state of violence with the police, but to organize opportunities and forums where policemen can understand their own particular rage and to create opportunities for them to recover their humanity as human beings, such that over time as well, there was this realization that human liberation from these oppressive ways of being, from oppressive structures, will not come necessarily from the pain and suffering, that's being addressed by social justice work, but from cultivating and inculcating a deep sense of love. The other example is that this particular model, particularly for people of color, is very recovering. It helps to recover their own humanity in the process of social justice work. It is one thing to internalize the oppressiveness and the sense of being living in dominant structures. You internalize the messages, you internalize a way of being that is very destructive. However, over time of the practice, you come to realize that you're part of a larger consciousness, that there's a sense in which you are transcendent, you're bigger than the physical body, and that your focus is not so much on the limited nature in what has been projected onto you and what you have internalized, but your work is about connecting ever so powerfully and so deeply with this deeper part of yourself. And so while the work in the world, your work and service in the world is about reversing injustice, you realize that there are two realities that you're operating under simultaneously, that your work in the world is to reverse injustice, and at the same time that you are part of an absolute reality that is transcendent, that is boundless, that is to which you are connected, and to which ultimately you surrender to this deep space, for not only for your own personal liberation, but for the liberation of humanity. And finally, there is the sense in which, when this model has been used in the past, that this notion of love, particularly for social justice activists and organizers, is a very somehow difficult idea to grasp, because the predominant notion of love is sentimental love. And somehow their understanding of sentimental love, it doesn't seem as if that holding that space is a very strong space of being. That is a bit wimpy, actually. And that that this love for all of humanity is not something that is immediately embraced, particularly for communities that are struggling for justice. And so the meditations that focus on bringing a deeper understanding of what love is, loving kindness, for example, this approach over time helps people to understand that they are part of a boundlessness of love, and that really there's no other person, there's no other, that we're all part of what there is. And with that notion, they realize that there's only one humanity, and with that understanding as well, it strengthens their ability to challenge those who they perceive as being the perpetrators of injustice. They understand over time that holding a deep space of love means that not that you are wimpy, not that you are weak, not that you're collapsed in the face of injustice, but that you're actually strengthened by it. that you have the capacity with this strength of purpose and intention and boundless love to challenge injustice from a deeper place of knowing, a deeper place that that does not undermine or negate the humanity of yourself and the other, that you can hold, you can absolutely hold the humanity of the other person at its deepest level at the same time that you address and confront the sources of injustice. And so this model is critical, because at the core and base of it, it is suggesting that these structures of dominance and dominated perhaps are useful in the process of our own liberation, perhaps are useful in and on the path of connecting with presence, that it is something that that we might want to consider as being welcomed and not run away from. And so the value of contemplative practice in supporting response is that mindful observation is important, that insight and wisdom is a boon of this process, that loving kindness and presence really supports activism and not the reverse, that the contemplative practices are important tools. They're important tools for the recovery of our humanity. They're important tools in facing one's own oppression. They're important in that they support us in noticing our defensiveness. They show us where we get trapped in these structures, systems that we live in. They really allow us to take right action from a place of integrity, action from a place that honors the humanity of everyone, which is the fullest expressions of love. They help us to recover our own humanity, and they're helpful. They're very helpful for social justice workers and others who are looking for a process that includes the body, the mind, and the spirit, and that sustains their energy for a significant amount of time. And so with that, I pass it back to Raúl for a wrap-up and final comments.
Actually, I'm looking at the clock and trying to remain open and not
okay,
and not anxious and reactive. That we only really have about less than 10 minutes, because I know that Beth will need to close out with some remarks, and I want to take time for a question. So why don't we move, Rose? If you can click one more time and move to that blue slide. And I move to questions. There's certainly a lot more that can be said. You know, examples or many experiences on how, you know, not only I and we have used this, but how, you know, so many people, you know, the people that have been trained and have practiced this have used it in their work. So how do we deal with questions, Beth?
So someone wants to know whether the slides will be available. And I can just say that we are recording this webinar, so this will be archived and it'll be on our site afterwards for the public to view. So you will be able to review these slides, yes.
Yeah. So I wonder if there's any, okay, how do you suggest this gets enfolded into the classroom? It's so many different ways, you know. Maybe Rose can speak to this at some point. All I can say that just recently I gave a doctoral level course in oppression, social justice, and social policy, and shared much of this. It was my book happened to be a required text, and not because I assigned it; it was somebody else. But I must say, so in so many different ways, it really is available to. It'll take some time to really give students a different lens, different lenses in terms of the analysis of how it is that they're going to look at the world. But I think that one of the key things that's important for us as educators, that as we enter the classroom, that if not anything, so we're not only clear about that there is oppression and different forms of oppression in the world, sexism, classism, all of that, but that but what is our place in it, and what is our role in it, and therefore, if we're going to be teaching contemplative practice, as I know that, or as I understand that many of you do, that that you can begin to consider that that this as an ongoing practice, of course, and as a quick fix, can can be helpful, and useful, and it is an essential tool for everyone, teachers and students and all, in the dynamics in negotiating student life and all the politics that goes on campus. Rose, do you have anything to add to this, or is there might be another question or a follow-up question? Yeah, I teach design. Does that help? I'm not sure what that's referring to. So, Kathleen, you could care to clarify. Is there any way, Beth or Rose, could you ask Beth you could actually get a voice? I think that Beth mentioned that there was a way we could take an actual voice call. Oh, there's a hand raised from Candace. How do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you hear me?
Candace. Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Hi, Raúl. Hi, Rose.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I teach cultural anthropology, and I think as maybe someone mentioned earlier, Rose is also a sociocultural anthropologist. And let me just be quick. I'm interested in figuring out how or what kinds of assignments I can develop for students that would help them to assess their place in the world and their role in either the facilitation or the disruption of the kinds of problems and situations that you talked about with oppression on the basis of gender. I mean, we talk a lot about that in the classroom, but I've been trying to come up with various assignments to help them figure themselves into the text as opposed to reading the text from a more distant space. So I was just wondering if you could speak more to how you raise that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a thought, unless you want to go.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. One thing that we do that I also assign in workshops and in the classroom is to do pretty much what Bailey Jackson and Rita Hardiman had devised, even though I use a different format. But it is to get students to see the different social identities and the relationship between the dominant and subordinated, and identify. Okay, so and all of these, because we have all of them. It's not that I get to choose that I'm only want to deal with race. I also have to deal with gender, and so that we see ourselves and locate. So am I a man? So where does that place me in terms of this relationship, this power relationship, my dominant subordinated, and therefore, and throughout the 8 or 10 different categories, and that gives so immediate sense of where they're at and what that means. And also in terms of, their field of study. So I was working with social work students. So that what would that mean for them as helping professionals, as future social workers, in terms of their relationship, their own identities, and their professional role within the institution that they're going to be working in or currently working. So those are some immediate uses.
I can take one more question. Who are some of the people who have influenced the development of your ideas about love, that there is no other, the importance of love and kindness? This is from Tom Basserer. Essentially, my influence, the people who have influenced me, come from the Buddhist tradition. It comes from my own spiritual tradition, which is West African based, West African derived. So it comes from an eclectic array of ideas and individuals who are in a number of different spiritual tradition. It is grounded in meditation and a number of other spiritual practices.
So this is Beth again. I'm coming in, and just because we have to wrap things up, it was wonderful to hear from you. Thanks for sharing everything that you did. And wonderful that you were all participating. Thank you for your questions, and especially to Rose and Raúl. I just want to say that our next webinar will be on contemplative arts and society, and that's scheduled for Wednesday, April 28th, again at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that will be Ann Bethel, Associate Professor of Art at Syracuse University, and she's one of our Contemplative Practice Fellows. So, any final words, Raúl, or farewell?
Yes, it was good. It's a little frustrating that I wish that, again, I could see you all and be able to hear your questions, and I hope that we have a chance to do that, in person and live sometime soon.
Great. We'll look forward to that. Thank you, Raúl. Thank you, Rose, and thanks to you all. Bye-bye.